I'm going to introduce the panel, and then I'm going to ask them to say a few words about themselves and their companies. Obviously, Patrick Quinlan is not here. He's the CEO of Rivet, and he had a conflict, so we're blessed to have Emily with us today, Emily Huang. She's the co-founder of Rivet and has been involved in this space for a while. And so, Emily, would you like to say a few words about your company?
Hi, I'm Emily. We started the company 8 years ago, actually starting from what if all the data is actually standardized? Wouldn't it be great? We can create a wonderful application analyzing the information. This is 2003. And then we realized no one is actually creating that data. So our company sort of took a turn and started producing the data, so we actually have something to analyze. Today, Rivet Software actually serves about 1,500 customers in US for their detail tagging and block tagging. And I'm very proud to say, I think my whole company focused on creating quality data more than anything else, mostly because my passion is in analyzing the data. So every time when we look at the data issue, I get very concerned about it. Patrick's not here today, but I know Patrick will probably say, Emily tried to sell some software to the people here, but I'm a technologist, really not going to do that. So, but if you have any question about anything that we do, feel free to contact me after the meeting. Thank you.
Next is Ed McDonnell. He's an Executive Vice President at EDGAR-Online. Ed?
Thanks, Mike. Most of you know EDGAR-Online mostly from its involvement with working with the SEC and delivering SEC-related information into the capital markets. About 5 years ago, we entered into the XBRL marketplace from a data perspective and from bringing a different type of data into the marketplace using XBRL. We have also used that technology and that expertise to do filings for a number of companies in the United States, as well as deliver software solutions to many of the central banks in EMEA, as well as out into Asia.
Thanks a lot, Ed. Mike, would you like to refresh your disclaimer or make any comments?
Look, if it wasn't clear the first time around, these are my views.
Okay.
That's simple.
Great. So now that we've got the panelists introduced to you, this general panel discussion is going to be focusing on how organizations and individuals are actually using XBRL to enhance their performance. And that could be inside of a company, it could be an analyst, it could be an organization like the SEC and otherwise, but it's about how people are actually today using XBRL to enhance their performance. So let's start with the question around what's the problem? So why is XBRL useful to third parties, to analysts, to stakeholders? What have analysts been using and what have been the problems to date? Why can't they keep using what they've always used? Why isn't that good enough? And Ed, you're sort of in the middle of this space. Why don't we get you to kick it off and tell us what's the actual problem we're trying to solve here?
Sure, and it's interesting, Mike, because many people in the community today, when you look at the capital markets and look at the corporate enterprise, will tell you that there isn't a problem. Fundamental data has been around for many, many years. It's been back-tested for many, many years. The problem they have is error rates. So when you look at the main data aggregators across the world, they run error rates in upwards of 20 to 30% on the information they provide downstream into the analyst community, into the corporate enterprise. Many will ask, well, why is that? And the real problem is it's manual collection. So when you look at all the main aggregators out in the marketplace, they're manually collecting information off of what might be an SEC filing, what might be an HMRC tax report. They are manually collecting information using hundreds of people offshore to then bring downstream into their product. The second challenge that you have is a normalization problem. Each one of the data aggregators has their own taxonomy. Each one of them have their own normalization and standardization process, and each one of them will deliver a different number out into the marketplace. If you go to any investment banking desk where somebody has a Bloomberg, a Capital IQ, or a FactSet on their desk, you will see a different EBITDA number if you type in IBM from all three of them, because they all standardize differently down to the EBITDA line. That happens in plant, property, and equipment, and happens at the revenue line. So the problem they're trying to solve are, I think it's probably three things. One is speed. When you look at any company outside the Fortune 500, it takes an upwards of 2 weeks at time of filing to actually deliver that number into a fundamental data set, because it has to go through the collection and standardization process. The second would be accuracy. What does XBRL solve? It solves purity. It has to be true. It's an originally sourced data item. And the third is granularity. XBRL allows you to get much deeper into a financial statement, both at the primary financial statement level as well as into the detailed disclosures that companies are now reporting. And with all of the, and Mike, you'll appreciate this, with all of the different requirements that the SEC puts on companies, more and more disclosures are happening, especially at the K level each and every year. Therefore, that information is not being made transparent, which is what the SEC is trying to solve for, into the marketplace.
Anybody else want to add to that, Mike?
Yeah, I'll add a couple of things. You know, when I thought about this question as Mike was asking it, you know, the first thing that came to my mind is timeliness. You know, it's a little bit like someone asking Alexander Graham Bell, why do we need a telephone? We get the messages delivered today. So we can stick with the carrier pigeon and the Pony Express. They work. They get the job done. I think it's about, there are a couple of problems that I'll address. One is timeliness, simply getting the information timely. Just think about a process where the information, if I think about it from a U.S. perspective, the information hits the SEC system, and 30 seconds later, you have it. So timely, accurate information. The second issue that you don't hear about very often is what I think of as the democratization of information. 5 years from now, information that was difficult to obtain 5 years ago is going to be available, accessible by everyone. All you have to do is look at what Google did for information and compare that to what will happen with financial information, to understand that sometimes the problem you're solving isn't a problem that people recognize exists, but it's there.
Okay. Well, we mentioned fundamental data, and that's a data set that's being sold by third-party aggregators. So talk to us a little bit more about fundamental data. What's the problem with it? Why isn't that good enough? I mean, if I'm getting 500 data elements from my data aggregator, why isn't that good enough? Ed, Emily, go ahead.
Can I jump in?
Go ahead.
Okay, I think both Ed and Mike has talked about a lot about the problems with fundamental data set. And I think one view I want to kind of emphasize, and I don't know if you see my view this way, it's one company's view, it's one group of people's view. And I think today with the data, especially standardized like XBRL, can be available right away, can be widely available. I have to assume that collective intelligence of the market can probably provide a much better data models for people to use. I heard something last night at dinner. Somebody said that Mike is really good with analogy. I'm really not good with analogy, but I'm going to try anyway. I look at XBRL data as ingredients for making food, right? So you can provide a buffet, or you can provide some sort of 5-star menu that you can charge a lot of people a lot of money for. And I think today, because availability of the XBRL data, a lot of vendors like us really can make this data available, not just in the traditional BI sort of way, but actually bringing the social paradigm. So people can share information, people can comment on information, especially one thing I really, really love is about mobile delivery. So you can have this information delivered to your mobile devices. So I don't think there's major problems with data aggregators or fundamental data set, but that's what they are. They're just fundamental data set. They're just data set provided by a group of people using their intelligence. And I think XBRL should enable the social paradigm, then we all get a chance to say what this data is good for, and we all get a chance to provide our point of view. And to me, that's kind of important thing.
Yeah, to add to that, and I absolutely agree with Emily's views, is that it's static information. When you look at the fundamental data sets that are out there today, it's static, and it might not be accurate the next day that you look at it. Therefore, it creates problems for issuers that are trying to tell their story. And the issue that I have with fundamental data sets today is that it doesn't tell the issuer story, primarily because it's late. XBRL solves that problem. Like Mike said, when it hits the EDGAR database, the as-reported data sets that are available out there, and they're available by the two companies that are sitting up here, absolutely provide a level of transparency, a level of speed, and a much deeper, more accurate product out into the marketplace for companies to use in analytical processes.
So we're drawing a picture here of a supply chain in which companies report, some third party takes that information, puts it in their own taxonomy, and then sells it to the analyst community. That's what's going on, and Ed has outlined that there's a pretty big error distortion rate in that translation process. So XBRL allows us to go direct. Now, how do we identify with the analyst community that they actually have this problem? What are some of the things they do to work around this issue with fundamental data? So how can we help them identify their problem?
Sure, I'll take that, Mike. Couple things that they do. One, they have to go through an additional validation process. So when they get the data from one of the aggregators, they're also putting it through their own quality control. Adds time to the analytical process. The second thing that they have to do is potentially create their own normalization. So they're going to go back and check the filing itself, create a secondary manual process, collect that data, pull it into their Excel models, and then do their own normalization. The challenge that many analysts have in the capital markets, both on the sell side and on the buy side, is that they don't want to trust somebody else's normalization process or somebody else's standardization process. They want their own. They have their own way of calculating EBITDA. They have their own way of thinking about plant, property, and equipment. They have their own way of thinking about the debt line and what should or should not be included. And this gets really granular when you start getting into credit analysis. And credit analysis is where XBRL is being used. I would say where it's coming up the curve the most, specifically in commercial lending, both in the private and the public sector, as well as in just typical NRSRO workflows. The problem that most analysts have today, and Emily, I'm sure you see this as well, is that they have additional processes to get to an analytical decision. And right now, if you look at the capital markets, the one thing they don't have time for is additional process, additional time, or additional mistakes. So if I'm taking a manually collected data set and then putting it through my own manual collection, I have additional error rates that are going to come through because I have too many humans interacting in the supply chain.
Mike or Emily, want to add to that?
No?
Okay. So just to give you a quantitative amount, a buy-side or sell-side firm who's buying this third-party data is probably paying something they would measure in millions of dollars for this data. When I say millions of dollars, I don't mean one or two. I mean somewhere between 10 and 40, depending on the size of the firm. So that's the amount of money they're spending for something that they're getting that has plenty of errors, untimely, lots of problems. And that's the point Mike's making around timeliness. So timeliness costs them a lot of money, and what they're getting really isn't what the companies are telling their own story. So we sort of identified the problem now, and each of you have your own tools, your own customer base. Can you give us some examples of how some of your customers are using the XBRL data to enhance their performance, and what kind of interface are they using? You know, give us a scenario or two.
Okay, so I can sell my product right now?
You can give us some scenarios of how people are using your product.
Okay. We talk about data aggregator. I don't think I can tell you which one, but actually one of the largest data aggregators started using our tool to process XBRL information already 3 years ago. And I've been talking to different data aggregators in US, in UK. I haven't talked to anyone in Asia yet, but I'm pretty sure probably most of the data aggregators are thinking about, okay, now this XBRL is here, how can I save money? How can I provide more accurate data set? So I think there's hope, even though we talk a lot about their limitation to how they actually process the fundamental data set today, but I think combining their experience with the availability of the XBRL data, the future is pretty bright. So I want to give you two other examples if I could. One example is actually my own company. So we're very small. So we were very small. We have about 20 people, I think 3 years ago, we have about 600 people right now. But we're still very, very small. So in order to operate this small company to make sure that we watch everything, we actually basically use our own product to produce a performance reporting in a way. So I take our GL data and kind of convert it into XBRL GL and load it into our system. And then we have our budget data. Basically, I produce a taxonomy, which is pretty simple, give it to every department, and they put in the budget data, and then we put it into our system. And so we can do budget actual variance report. Another thing that I also could do is, for example, we compete with EDGAR-Online. They file XBRL. So what we do is we can actually take their published financial, again, take into our Crossfire product. Now I can actually look at expenses, look at revenue. Actually, I do look at it, by the way, every quarter, just to see how we can compete with a public company. So XBRL really isn't just for public company only. Especially as a small company like ours, we really have to operate from all different angles, right? Internal reporting, external reporting comparison. So we're kind of using our own product to do this. Another example I want to give you very quickly, I don't know if you know about this company, it's called Microfinance Exchange. So they kind of manage the microfinance information. It's a nonprofit organization. So 3 years ago, they started looking for something to improve the performance, can get the data accurately, but with lower cost. So they decided on XBRL. Right now, Mix is actually using our product to tag. So they have analysts all over the world actually collecting the microfinance data, and they put into our product, and that flows into the database. So they not only they can tag, because when they're doing tagging, they have calculation link base, they have validation rules, they can make sure the data is actually accurate, and also turn around right away, they can analyze the information. Because of this, they just released their second website just a couple weeks ago, and I look at it, it's very, very cool, because the data now is being serviced in a very interactive sort of way with very low cost. So there are lots of examples out there. Besides the 1,520 companies that are using our product to tag, I can tell you a lot of companies are thinking, what else can I do with it? Now I actually pay the price to tag so we can submit to the SEC. What can I get out of it? And I think that's a very positive thing that's going on in the market.
Thanks, Emily. I want to highlight something that Emily said, and then I'm going to come back, Ed, to both you and Mike and ask you for some examples. But she talked about how they're using it to consume not only somebody else's public information, but she also mentioned ledger information and budget information. So here's a company that's using this internally as well, just to highlight the point she made. Ed, do you want to talk about some of the uses you're seeing across your customer base?
Sure, and to add to what Emily's saying, we are seeing it also in the private sector as well, and I think Oracle's a sponsor here in a lot of their Disclosure Manager products, and they're taking information straight from the GL for a lot of public companies that use Hyperion, and also pulling that down straight through into an XBRL format. And if you look at the corporate use case, really it's about benchmarking and peer analysis, both benchmarking at the number level as well as benchmarking at the tag level. So you are seeing entities out there, call it Microsoft, that will look at their financials, see how they're tagging versus one of their competitors out in the marketplace, as well as looking at the numbers that sit behind it. The other, I'd say, use cases that we're seeing, one of them's right here in Canada over at the DICO, and I think SQL Power's here in the audience. They've developed some really great analytic tools for the DICO, who adopted XBRL for their call reports, to look into those call reports and start doing analysis of who's solvent, who's not solvent, who's trending, and solving problems for the DICO that they weren't able to solve before, now that they're using XBRL as a technology. When you look at the capital markets, there's a couple of use cases. The one that we see the most is in the quantitative firms, so quantitative hedge funds, quantitative analysis at the mutual funds, where they're using the as-reported data to pull into the proprietary models to now drive decisions at a much faster rate, specifically at the Fortune 1500 and below companies. So the small cap, mid cap types of managers are using as-reported data sets to fund models and make trading decisions faster, that they can, now that they can get the information much more accurately and much more timely. And the other use case that we see is in the investment bank, specifically at the tax advisory group. So there's always been a ratings advisory group at the investment banks. Now most of them have tax advisory groups that consult internally for all of the investment bankers, and we're seeing XBRL used there to get specific information around litigation fees, around tax disclosures, out of the detailed tag footnotes that are being provided by companies into the marketplace. And to extend on what Emily said, I think the last one that we see and that we've been involved with for many years is with the rating agencies. So we have a major rating agency that uses our technology to collect information worldwide from all of their banking analysts. They use XBRL to collect that in a single format, drive it downstream into a readable and usable data set that can be leveraged across the entire enterprise. And they are collecting both private and public company information across the world in order to drive that.
Wow, that's an incredible range of applications. Mike?
Well, of course, we don't have any customers, but And we don't like to talk about the processes that we use to review financial statements, at least not publicly. But I can tell you this. The interesting thing about XBRL is it works in the background. Some analysts use it and aren't aware that they're using it. I think over time they'll probably become aware because of what I said earlier. They get the information quicker, faster, more accurately. And some of them may be smart enough to ask why. They're getting it quicker, more timely, more accurately. At the SEC, we have some constraints. For those of you who are not from the United States, there's been a lot of debate and discussion in the United States about the federal budget. And of course, we're part of the federal government. And there's a lot of pressure brought to bear on our budget. So we operate with two constraints. One is that, as I said before, it's earlier days, there's a limited amount of data, and we have a limited capacity to really use that data. Now, that said, this fiscal year, which just started, we have increased the number of tools that we have available for the staff by 5-fold. I always say 5-fold because going from 20 or 25 to 125 doesn't sound like a big leap, but believe me, it is. The other thing is that it's real clear that there have been registrants who've received comment letters where the initial or the origin of the comment was an analysis of structured data. They never know that's where it came from because we look at a lot of sources of information. So the short answer is that we're using it, and I think we are going to see that use really start to accelerate in the coming year. And Walter's sitting there nodding his head, and he is right.
So what's the user interface? Mike, you said that some of the analysts may not realize they're using it, sort of like my mother and grandmother don't know they're using HTML. What's the user interface for most of the analysts that are using your products? Or they're analyzing the reports in the SEC, Mike? What's that UI look like?
It looks like Microsoft Excel.
Does anybody have a different answer?
No? Yeah.
Okay, so what we've done is we've taken the accountant's hammer and we've turned it into a pneumatic air gun. That's the analogy, okay? And if you go into a construction site today, most professional carpenters, they use pneumatic air guns. They have a hammer on their belt, but they actually use pneumatic air guns because they're cheaper, better, faster. And the same idea here. So when we are talking to analysts, I think it's a really useful idea to be able to identify the things that were talked about early on, lower cost, more timely, because they're not going to know where this stuff's coming from. They may know because they're getting it sooner and there's a lot more of it, but they may not. And so it may take some education and dialogue to kind of drive through that problem. So now that we're using this, what are some of the quality issues that we actually see with the data, with the XBRL data? What are some of the issues we see that they may flush up pretty quickly and kind of mess up analysis? What are you seeing out there?
A couple of things that we see, Mike, from mostly at the issuer side, but negative values that are being reported are definitely hurt the accuracy of the database. An example would be treasury stock is commonly put in as a negative value. It's a debit item in the credit section. It should be put in as a positive value. It's instances like that that absolutely hurt the accuracy of the data. I would say, and something that we believe in, is that extensions hurt the database. If you look at the amount of extensions that have happened in the SEC use case, they simply have gotten out of control. And it makes comparability and benchmarking extremely difficult for companies, and it's created inconsistencies and a lot of ambiguity in the U.S. GAAP taxonomy. That's become a major issue when you try to bring this downstream. So we're all up here talking about how great the analytical capabilities of XBRL can be. We haven't realized that in the marketplace yet. There's some use cases, there's some people doing it, but specifically from an SEC use case perspective, it's become very difficult to realize true analytical capabilities because of the extension libraries. I think that's a big problem that we're facing.
Emily?
I think those issues have been mentioned probably for a long time now. Negative value mostly relate to XBRL is still kind of new, and people don't know how to translate the accounting information into this technical format. But I'm going to talk about something a little bit different. It's actually the sourcing of the data. A lot of time what we see is people are copy-paste the information from the Excel file or get it from like 10 different departments from their company and manually put in this data. So when you're doing that, no matter how careful you try, there's still going to be a problem, especially once you put in the data, how do you know it's right? You can't really drill all the way back. And I think this is the reason why I mentioned internal reporting. I don't know if Eric Cohen is here. He'll be glad that I plug XBRL GL again. Because it's really, really important. You cannot just do this one side. You have to do this from the sourcing of the data. If the data can flow into a tagging application, for example, let's say you have this line item, which is your total revenue, but it's really coming from a lot of revenue account in your GL, and you can drag those accounts, and then you consolidate into an output account, which is the US GAAP revenue, then you can drill all the way back and see all your transactions if you want to. And I think until people do that, until you can aggregate the data before you author your document, and then at the end, analyze the information with your external competitors and look at the tag selection, unless you do this entire route in a very consistent way, I think it's very difficult to talk about quality, only focusing on, say, negative number extension. This whole thing is much bigger than that.
It's a supply chain issue, as you're
Supply
pointing
chain
out.
issue.
Yes.
Yes.
Mike, how about you? You have probably a great perspective on some of the things you're seeing in reports.
Well, one thing we see is we see the number of errors coming down. We see the number of extensions coming down. Now, I guess if we're going to put in plugs today, I'll put in a plug. We have lifted the liability limitation for filers. And if filers don't think that that's serious, then they should rethink that decision. You know, at some point, we're going to see widespread use of this information in the marketplace. And as we approach that point, we're not going to treat errors as something that's trivial. We're going to treat them the same way that we treat errors in a financial statement, the same way if you put brackets around a number and it should be positive, the same way if you omit a disclosure or call it the wrong thing. So I guess the point is that while we see them coming down, I would say they're not an acceptable level. And I think you have to look at what filers can do. The first thing you do is review the right document. And that's not the rendering document. Review the actual exhibit. The second thing, if you're not comfortable doing that, get a third party involved. There are several third parties that can do that review for you. So, you know, Mike, we see it coming down, but it's still not at an acceptable level. And I fully appreciate that we're still in a transition phase. And, you know, I take great heart in the fact that it's coming down, but, you know, as we get closer to completion of this transition, those errors need to approximate what you see in financial statements, which is as error-free as possible.
Absolutely. Emily or Ed, do you have any other thoughts on what preparers might do to bring that error rate down some more?
I agree with what Emily said, and if I'm giving a plug for Eric Cohen, then great, which is you got to get directly to the GL. You have to get the source data. The benefit that XBRL does bring downstream is that it's originally sourced information. That's what makes it inherently more powerful than anything any of the data aggregators are doing in the marketplace. If you can get that at the time of inclusion at the GL, that inherently improves the quality of the data being brought downstream.
Emily?
And I think the reviewing tool probably also have a good place here because, as you said, a lot of companies are either thinking or start the process of taking the tagging, the preparation of the 10K, 10Q, including XBRL in-house. So after they do the tagging, how do they know what they tag is actually correct? I know there are a lot of tools out there, but I'm not sure that all the tools are really best built for accountants to use. So I think the market need to probably produce more user-friendly tools that speak to the accountants and point out, because when you're reviewing, I think I heard yesterday, some company actually disclosed like 22,000 facts or something like that. There's no way for them to go round to round, actually review all these 22,000 facts. But if somehow the publication can highlight the possible area the reviewer need to pay attention to, then it will narrow down the scope of the review, then the preparer can probably do a much better job in ensure the quality. But I think, as you heard me say many times already, sourcing the data is probably the most important thing. Unless you have that, it's really difficult to say the quality.
So sort of like in the maturity of any process, we've got the analytical tools. Currently are third-party ideas. Eventually those may be built into some of the built-in applications, so you have sort of a dashboard of analytical capabilities, but right now those are separate tools. And so to Mike's point around having them look at the right document, not the rendering, that's just a very simple educational point that we in the XBRL community could certainly help companies understand. I do see some folks from the assurance community out there, and I think the comment Mike made on third-party involvement is speaking to that community as well. So that's another way to really help companies improve on the quality of their reports. But is this really just about Ks and Qs, or are there other types of information that the analysts might want to have structured? So what other types of information do you see out there that maybe we should be talking to companies about?
I think MD&A. It's always interesting when I was looking at, like I said, I'm a technologist. I really don't know debits from credits, to tell you the truth. When I'm looking at our company financial, the part that really interests me is the MD&A, because it tells the story. It gives you the background, the context around information I'm looking at. And I'm surprised that actually wasn't included. Also, recently somebody pointed this out to me, is in the 10K, the company need to disclose like a 5-year core financial data, and that wasn't required to be in XBRL. If that's actually required, I think that's going to make the analysis a lot easier, because you can go back 5 years and look at the core financial data. So maybe, Mike, we can mandate that part? Your view, I mean.
Well, I think that there's a lot of information, based on my discussions with investors, that could be tagged and would be useful. We talked about MD&A. Press releases comes up a lot. You talk to investors, the first thing they look at is the press release, and it depends on the company and how robust, how detailed that press release is, but that certainly would be beneficial. The only caution I would add here is that, we don't want to get so far in front of this that we actually hurt the progress that we've made to date. So while it would be good to have a lot of things tagged, and believe me, those of you who know me know this, I'm probably as aggressive as anybody about getting new things done. I've spent a lot of my time looking at strategy and looking at new products and looking at how accounting firms can improve their business. But sometimes you can bring about too much change too rapidly. And my caution would be, let's make sure that we get this right, because if we get this right, if we get the basic financials and footnotes right, and investors start to see that it's available, and individual investors start to see it's available, and we at the SEC say, this is for real, meaning it's used in the marketplace, and our mandate is to protect investors. At that point, I think everything else you can talk about will just fall into place. So when people have asked me about this, and I've been asked about it recently, in fact, I've got an upcoming meeting to discuss it, my answer has been slow down. Just slow down a little bit, and let's get this bit right, because if we get this right, the dam is going to burst. And we don't have to worry about that other stuff because it'll be pulled. We won't have to push it anymore, it's going to be pulled.
Great advice. Ed?
Yeah, I tend to agree with Mike that there's a lot of use cases that you can bring and utilize XBRL for. The one that's sitting in front of everybody right now, and if we do get it right, you will effectively change and disrupt the nature of the way financial information is utilized in the capital markets, and that's getting the detailed tagged footnotes correct. There is a wealth of information that companies put into their detailed disclosures each and every year, and that information right now is not unlocked inside the marketplace. And nobody solved that problem at this point. EDGAR-Online hasn't solved it. It's definitely something that we are trying to solve. I know Emily and her firm are trying to solve it as well. But that is where there's such a wealth of information, and I could tell you that I have talked to at least 6 of the top 10 major investment banks across the world that are trying to solve it themselves, and they can't do it. If we're able to bring the information that's in those detailed disclosures into the marketplace, it will fundamentally change the way analysis is done on individual issuers.
Yeah, I would add to that that's an issue that we're actively looking at, because we want to make sure that we're not putting a burden on companies for information that's not being used. At the same time, we agree with what Ed just said, and that is that there's a wealth of information in those footnotes, and we'd like to untap it. And frankly, what we'd like to see is, I'm pleased that the investment banks and others are looking at it, but they're looking at it from their self-interest. If they can tap it, I can promise you that it won't be an open source tapping of that information, because it will enable them to continue their competitive advantage. Why we're looking at it is what I said earlier. We want to open up this information to the public. Go back to what I said before. You know, the best regulatory tool that I have is a well-informed market.
So let's dig into this a little bit more, because this goes back to what was mentioned earlier, the financial data sets, which is how many elements? 300 to 500, 600, something in that range?
From my knowledge, if you look at the major data aggregators, they average around 700 data elements.
Okay. And so we compare that to the number of elements that might be in an XBRL filing, which would be exponentially larger than that?
I'll do my sales pitch. So we have in upwards of 9,000 data elements in our data set.
Okay.
Today.
So we're talking 700 versus 9,000. And some portion of that is what Mike's talking about, unlocking for the marketplace and making that stuff available to everyone to make decisions on. That's what we're after here.
Yeah, you have to expand on that too, because as we're at an international conference, we shouldn't so much focus on an SEC use case here. Unleashing this for 10,000 public companies within the SEC is fantastic, and I think that the marketplace has to get there. But now you have to also think about Companies House. You have to think about Infograph. You have to think about InfoCamera. You have to think about all the other reporting entities that live across the world, and you have to start bringing it together in a standardized form, because the marketplace is not a US-based marketplace anymore. If you look at the way the capital market structure is today and the way trading happens and the way investment decisions happen, it is not based on whether or not you want to buy Microsoft or IBM. It's based across how that happens at on a global stream, how companies are reporting information globally, how they're taxed differently based on their globalization efforts. We have to make this bigger than the SEC. And right now, outside of the central banks in most of the European and Asia communities, this has not gotten into a reporting stream. The HMRC is going to try to do that this year, obviously, and that will bleed over to Companies House, but this has to get bigger than the SEC. I do believe that the SEC is the toughest nut to crack, and I think Mike and his team have done an amazing job of getting us there, but that has to go down. It has to flow into a global marketplace.
Emily or Mike, any other thoughts?
One thought. First of all, I agree with that. I think I focus on the SEC, but that's primarily because I want to share our experience, because I haven't necessarily learned a lot, but I know that the team, Walter and Susan and others, have learned a lot in this process, and I think it's important that we share it. One of my concerns is that we need to be really careful with the taxonomy as we move to one global accounting standard, and we're moving in that direction. I said earlier in response to a question, I have no idea where the SEC is going with that at this point, because that's a decision that will be made by the 5 commissioners. But as the world moves to one global accounting standard, we cannot afford to have multiple taxonomies for that one global standard, because if that happens, we won't have one global standard. So, one of my concerns is I just think about the global capital markets. And when I talk to investors in the U.S., generally the first thing they tell me is that they are interested in the global capital markets. And that's their pitch to start to move to greater comparability, move to one standard. But as I look at that, I really am concerned if we're not careful, we could end up with variations of varied taxonomies for IFRS, and that will mean that we don't have one global accounting standard, and that would be actually a tragedy.
Missed the golden opportunity. Emily?
I completely agree. This one data aggregator I'm talking about, they started looking at Asian data just because it's standardized, it's easy to analyze, and then they start tackling the US data. But the question I always get is, there's so many taxonomies out there, just because they're available doesn't mean it's transparent, doesn't mean it's comparable. So until we have a single standard that everybody agreed to, it's still very difficult to digest all this information available, especially now with the explosion of the data. A lot of time we'll be spending on mapping the information from company to company, country to country, industry to industry. That's probably a major task of a lot of people involved.
Absolutely. I want to go back and comment on the idea of other types of information. We heard MD&A, press releases. Mike is warning us, let's get the financial statements right. There is a maturity curve here as companies move from an outsourcing idea to building it in. Once they start building in, they sort of expand that footprint. So what starts off very naturally as financial statements can easily expand to other documents that financial information might be in, like a press release. And so here we have Max Mansour, who's been working on corporate actions for that very reason. And so Max and I have actually called on companies to talk to them about this. And it's a difficult discussion for a company who's never tagged XBRL, but for a company who's done a built-in and is already producing their reports in that way, it's actually a very easy discussion to bring in the investor relations folks. And so I would just share that with you as Mike's point around getting it right. But once you do get it right, it is very easy to move it to another area. And we're seeing companies like Citigroup and Bank of New York Mellon, American Express, and others that are now beginning to move in that direction simply because they're just walking down the maturity path, maturity curve.
Mike, can I comment on that real quick, too?
Please.
And I know, Max, and yourself, you've also been talking to some of the major news wires, and they're going to start getting involved at the press release level. Fundamental data, financial statement data doesn't move markets. It doesn't move markets in real time. It doesn't move markets when somebody issues their information. It moves markets when the release comes out that says earnings are this or earnings are that, or we're making this change in our dividend. If you really want the capital markets to start to care about XBRL, get it into the place that drives the actual capital markets, which is the trading desk. And the trading desk cares about earnings releases. They care about dividend announcements. They care about MD&A disclosures. That's the stuff that people will, and they care about it in real time. And that's why XBRL is so important in the corporate action initiative, which I'm a big believer in. That's where you can have an impact on a marketplace, and that's where you can get people caring about the difference between something that's using XBRL technology versus something that they get over just a newswire. And it's an initiative that if you are going to continue to move horizontally across the chain, and again, I want to say I agree with Mike, I think you have to get one thing right first before you tackle on too much. But that's where real information lives, and that's where people, same-store sales numbers, earnings numbers, MD&A numbers, that's where everything's reported is in press releases. And they generally come out before the 8Ks.
Absolutely. So I got two last questions. The first one is this. Mike gave an example earlier around the telephone and how hey, we already get messages, why is that better? So what are some of the features that you might help users think about that would be in applications that would be, aha, I could do that? How would you describe a cell phone to someone 50 years ago? How would you describe the differentiating features in your collaborative applications that people may not be aware of?
Can I start? Okay. So I kind of struggle with myself today, thinking how much should I talk about this sort of social paradigm and using this information. I decided, okay, I'm just going to talk about it because I'm very passionate about it. I really do think a lot of time that people look at XBRL data still as islands, still right? I'm looking at my financial information, it's being tagged in this format, but I'm not really comparing, I'm not using my internal. So I think this whole information flow has to change. And also, I don't know if I know Mike said let's focus on the current core financial, but if I can go just outside a little bit, if you look at the government data, it's not just, we know our federal government is having some issues with budgets and things like that. I think it's about a year and a half ago, I worked with the Oversight Committee on the recovery.gov data. It's quite interesting because they built a beautiful website. I was so jealous about the website they built. But I don't think it's giving me the information I was looking for. So what I did was I XBRLized their information and loaded it into our application, and we actually did a presentation to the congressional staff. And they were asking questions like, how many jobs were actually created in this county in, say, Ohio? And we can answer like in a second. And they said their staff will take about 6 months to get the information from their website, the beautiful built website. So I think as a vendor, as a software provider, because I think everybody kind of plays a different role here, is what can you do to move forward this XBRL movement? It's about financial information, but let's not forget about it. It's not just about financial information. Definitely it's not just about the company, public company information. There's just so much information can be tagged and shared. And I know probably most of you have Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, that sort of thing going on. What if this information can be real time, shared with the people that you trust? I don't mean share with everybody, but share with the people you trust, and share with the people and receive their feedback. So not only you can make better investment decisions, I make terrible investment decisions. Whatever I buy, nobody should buy, basically. What if I can share with my peer that I know I can trust, and they can, like maybe Ed here, right? Give me some tips, and I can probably be a better investor. But beyond that, we can probably use the information to run our companies better. At least that's what I know how I can use the information for, is to make sure my company is on the right track. My company is spending the money in the right area to improve the performance. So that's what I think about. A software need to have the ability to kind of invoke passion, a little bit emotional usage of the software. It has to be personal. You have to make a connection with it. Not just about other people's data. It's about your information. Go and put your budget into a software. Tag it. If you really want to, I can actually teach you how. Tag it. And I think once you have the personal connection, XBRL becomes part of your life in a way. Unless all of us here be passionate about it and promote it in that way, I don't think that people outside can understand XBRL much. Yesterday when I entered the custom, the guy asked me, so what are you here for? I said, for a technical conference. He said, what is it? I say, XBRL. I feel a little bit embarrassed because I'm sure that he doesn't understand anything. He actually asked me, what does it stand for? And then Rob Blake was behind me and saying, this is not a social hour, so stop it. but I think it's our responsibility in some way to promote XBRL. And I'm very proud of my company because technology is the enabler, right? So if you have the right application and you can talk to people in the right way, you help them solve a real problem, then I think XBRL has a bright future.
Thanks a lot, Emily. Ed, would you like to add some thoughts?
I agree with everything Emily just said. I take it as a different thought process to it, which is I think you have to take XBRL out of the conversation. It's an amazing enabling technology. It does what no other technology does for metadata. It does what no other technology does for source data. People don't care that it's XBRL in the marketplace. People care that you get it to them faster. They care that you deliver it to them more cost effective and that you help them make decisions, whether it's an investment decision, whether it's a decision on where we should hire from a government perspective or which county is doing better than the next. XBRL is an enabling technology that allows decisions to be made with greater access to information, more accurate information, and more timely information. If you go out in the marketplace and talk about XBRL, as I have and had some experiences, you get looked at like you're the Loch Ness Monster. I mean, it's not a pretty sight when you're out talking about XBRL. When you talk about delivering data in a more timely fashion, a more accurate fashion, with more granularity, people care about that. They don't necessarily care the way you're getting it to them, but they care about the information. So I'm a big believer that we have to almost not stop talking about XBRL, but talk about it differently.
Absolutely. The cheaper, better, faster. Smarter idea. Okay, so we're going to wrap up with the last question.
Can I respond to that?
Oh, yes, absolutely, Mike, please. Sorry.
I was going to whether you said yes or no, but you know, I just want to reemphasize what both Ed and Emily said. You know, I have great admiration for the people who've pioneered this effort. So before I say what I'm about to say, I want you to understand that. I mean, great admiration. That said, one of my favorite quotes is a quote from Albert Einstein. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. I think this is about a new process to produce, distribute, and consume information. And I think that needs to be the focus. The second thing is look for areas where you can provide benefit to society. This isn't just, as Emily said, this is not just about financial information. This is about producing information in a new way, distributing it in a different way, and consuming it in a different way. And I'm old enough to have children. In fact, I'm old enough to have grandchildren. Have a new grandchild, by the way. They born on Saturday. In case you're interested, 9 pounds, 21 inches. Name is Caitlin. But look for ways that benefit society, because I can tell you that Caitlin, if I were 20 years from now to describe what I did today, she'll look at me and say, why didn't they get it? What was wrong with them? So don't continue to think about this the same way you have for the last 10 years, and that's not to take anything away from what you've done the last 10 years, because what you've done is great. But start to look at it differently and look at how you can benefit society.
Mike, thank you for those comments. Any last words of recommendation or counsel on how we can improve performance and analytical capabilities?
I think we talked a lot already.
Yeah, I guess my parting shot would simply be that I've been involved in the XBRL community now for about 2 years, and I've seen a lot of great people, heard a lot of great ideas, and it's been very, dare I say, academic. There's a bunch of people in this room that want to make this commercial, and I think it's incumbent upon everybody in this room and everybody in the community to bring this into a commercial state. As Mike said, there's a lot of people that are looking for this to push onwards, and if we get it wrong, it's on us that we got it wrong. And for those of you that know Charlie Hoffman, he pretty much tells me that on a daily basis, that if we get this wrong, it's on us. So it really, what we are focused on at EDGAR is how do we commercialize the technologies that live beyond, that live within XBRL, and how do we bring interesting information into the marketplace, financial or otherwise, leveraging a technology that over 10 years has done a really great job of getting it to where it's at. But we're not at a tipping point, we're not at an inflection point, and that's where I think the folks in this room and the providers that are looking at this technology really need to get to.
I think on the micro level, I just want to reemphasize, you need to be able to aggregate the information from your internal information flow into your authoring document, and then continuously analyze the information. Basically, looking at this whole XBRL experience from the public company perspective is a holistic sort of view. So if you look at it that way, then I think the quality of the data will be better. And on the macro level is, I totally agree with Mike. Let's do something good for the society. I was so excited when I actually built a solution for Oversight Committee, because I figure I'm doing something for my country now. I'm not charging them anything, by the way. How can you use this XBRL technology, an enabler, using software to do something good? Do something good for your community. It can be as small as big as you want to, but looking at XBRL as a higher goal in a way, I think that's probably the way I look at it mostly.
Mike, the last word?
Raise awareness.
Let's thank this panel for taking time to share with us today.